Halito.
Theo.
How Danyan Yahi Yaye.
Hishte.
We don't bete. OCO.
Este.
Hey, when me all win.
See you.
God. My name is Elizabeth Stroud. I am a Cherokee Nation citizen.
My name is Dan Savage, professor of political science at Northeastern State University. My areas of specialization are constitutional law and political philosophy.
My name is Dr. Christopher Weaver. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Northeastern State University. I'm an expert on American politics and political behavior in particular, especially among marginalized groups.
So my intention with this and my intention in kind of doing this podcast wasn't necessarily to talk about the importance of the vote that we like voting and like as a whole, but how we got to this point in the first place, and what things kind of happened to get us to this point. So the reason that I asked two of you probably more expertise in like the Constitution and like those things that kind of led up to the history then of this. And so something that has been talked a lot about, at least especially this year, is the 100th anniversary of the 20th Amendment. And there's been a lot of emphasis on women's right to vote. But something that has not been emphasized enough is that it was white women's right to vote. And so talking about, as I wanted to get into a little bit about, I think I meant I don't know.
19th Amendment.
Oh, right. The 19th. Yeah. But the history behind, I put down 14th and 15th. I'm not sure which one it actually is.
I think they're both relevant here in that neither, right, the 14th Amendment didn't extend citizenship to Native Americans, but the 15th Amendment also didn't, because in part due to the 14th Amendment's lack of inclusion of Native Americans, didn't extend any sort of voting protections to Native Americans, despite the stated purpose of the 15th Amendment, preventing states from discriminating on the basis of race. So I think you could argue neither applies, although I think the 14th Amendment is generally considered where, I mean, Dr. Savage perhaps can add more to this, but I think the 14th Amendment is generally considered where there was an explicit intention to deny citizenship to Native Americans to prevent the protections from both the 15th Amendment as well as other constitutional protections.
I'm not familiar with why they were trying to prevent Native Americans from becoming citizens in the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment says if you were born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. And of course, that would have technically included all Native Americans, but we know that didn't happen until 1924. But I don't know the history of how the 14th Amendment was specifically designed not to allow Native Americans to be counted as citizens.
I'm also not an expert on this question. I don't think it was anything about the design. I think explicit decisions after its ratification that were attempted to deny it. And I believe it not only to those born on reservation land, and so I suppose, conceivably not on American soil, but more broadly to deny citizenship to Native Americans born anywhere within, present day United States. But I'm like Dr. Savage, I'm not an expert historian on that subject.
Yeah, so I guess then the 15th Amendment is something that when talking about race, and so that's more so kind of where I wanted to go with this. And so obviously the 15th Amendment did not work as the way that it was intended to, as voting rights were not federally recognized for all races until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. But something that it was fought for state by state, which I think was really interesting, and how it didn't get federally recognized until like a few years later. So something that today, actually, something that was big that I saw not too long ago, in Montana, a judge struck down the law. I can't remember. It's the BIPA is the acronym for it.
Ballot Interference Prevention Act.
Yes, which was disenfranchising Native Americans on the reservations in Montana. And so obviously, even though we have the Voting Rights Act, even though we have all of those things, voters were still are still being disenfranchised.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess, can we talk about that, just how that's still coming into effect today? Barriers of voting.
Well, one thing, I mean, if we're talking about does a Native vote count, there's no greater evidence that it counts or that it's important than the fact that Montana's legislature is trying to prevent Native Americans from voting, just as the North Dakota legislature is when requiring street addresses for voter registration. I didn't know that the judge struck it down today. That was good.
Yeah, just a few hours ago is when that ruling came out.
I guess Get Out the Vote organizers they would go out because a lot of people living on reservations in Montana don't get mail service, and so they would collect ballots, and the average collector would collect about 85 ballots. And now, well, this law was supposed to limit them to 6 ballots, and they had a fine of up to $500 per ballot if you brought a ballot to the post office for a relative or a neighbor. I mean, so they were intentionally trying to discourage people from taking these mail-in ballots and taking them to the post office.
Yeah, the ruling came out. I didn't get a chance to read through all of it. It was 61 pages.
But yeah,
And the ACLU, I saw a tweet from them probably about less than an hour ago, just breaking. And so I looked up an article and it said that it had been ruled unconstitutional because it violated the constitutional rights to vote, to free speech, and to due process of law, in which I didn't think all of those would be incorporated with that.
well,
But
the due process clause of the 14th Amendment is what's usually used to apply the Bill of Rights to the states.
Oh.
And so the 14th Amendment, I mean, the due process clause of the 14th Amendment it's what we call substantive due process, whereas it was originally created for procedural purposes, but substantive due process will say, well, if the substance of the law itself deprives somebody of a fundamental right, then we can strike it down even at the state level. The 14th Amendment allows you to do that.
And so, I haven't gotten a chance to look at that full ruling yet, but I'm interested, or I'm very curious of why free speech was, I don't know if that's considered a part of voting then, if they, obviously your right to vote is you giving your opinion. That's, you're saying to the government, this is who I want to represent me. And so I'm very curious if that's how that was a part of it, or.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to read it and to find out how they made the connection to speech.
But all of this just to say, this is something that's still affecting people today. And this is still something that, people are still gaining back their rights to vote, just depending on what area they live in. And especially those on reservations and on those lands are the ones that are disenfranchised the most, and the ones that have been failed the most, not only by the government, but out of those groups.
And it's actually a little bit worse today because of the fact that the Supreme Court no longer allows the pre-clearance of certain states under the Voting Rights Act. And when the Supreme Court did that, it was most people were thinking of southern states and blacks, but states like Alaska and Arizona had been added to the states that needed pre-clearance precisely because of their efforts to try to prevent Native Americans from voting.
Yes, could you talk more about pre-clearance, like what that means?
Well, under the amendments to the Voting Rights Act, if a state was identified as having in the past discriminated against a minority by preventing them from voting, that any change they made in their voting regulations had to be cleared by the Justice Department. So they had to show that their changes weren't going to adversely affect the minority. And like I said, almost everybody who writes about this, they're always talking about blacks in the South. But when Arizona and Alaska, and maybe I can't even remember if Utah was one of them, when they were added.
I think there are a few counties in South Dakota that were also covered by preclearance, not the entire state, but a few counties.
And so if they had done things in the past, then they would need preclearance. But the Supreme Court said that was ruled that was unconstitutional, because they said that, oh, well, this was based on data from the 1960s. And that's 50 years ago, and things have changed. And it's discrimination against those states or those counties to require them to get preclearance. But ever since that ruling, there's been a plethora of laws saying that, you need certain types of ID, and, that are specifically designed to hinder people, minorities specifically, from voting.
Do you know when that was?
2013, the Shelby County versus Holder decision.
And so prior to that, then, was preclearance actually helping to give people or to guarantee the right to vote, or was it kind of as it is now, like we're continuing to have to go to the courts to try to figure these things out?
The number of laws passed that make it more difficult to vote definitely increased after the ruling.
Basically, preclearance required that before a law changing any voting systems in a state or county that preclearance was required for, before those could go into effect, they had to receive approval, as opposed to our reactive justice system now, in which case, if a state imposes a law, you can sue, but it will have to work its way through the court. And potentially, barring a court decision somewhere along the way, be in effect until court strikes it down.
So who was the approval from? Who did they have to receive approval from to create?
The Department of Justice. Eric Holder, technically the defendant in the case, was the Attorney General.
And that makes you wonder if the preclearance was still in effect, and now you have the Trump Justice Department, whether how much effect it will have. But so it kind of depends on who's controlling the Justice Department.
And to your earlier point, I mean, that's always been true to a certain extent. So obviously, depending on the administration, the DOJ had been more or less active in enforcing or more stringent in its requirements for preclearance.
So that wasn't originally in the Voting Rights Act, though, was it? Or was that an amendment to the Voting Rights Act?
There's been several amendments. And the last one passed overwhelmingly, getting Democrats and Republican votes. And I'm thinking it's 2005, but I'd have to check on it. Maybe Christopher knows.
I can't
but
recall.
it was the one of the arguments of the dissent in the case was that this was Congress's job, and Congress overwhelmingly said these states still needed preclearance, and that it was both Democrats and Republicans who said that they needed preclearance. And so that really it wasn't the Supreme Court's business to be stepping in and deciding that no, they didn't.
I mean, I suppose it is worth noting, however, right? Preclearance wouldn't have applied to North Dakota, wouldn't have applied to Montana. Arizona, the Navajo Nation, of course, sued after 2018. Right, Arizona was covered under preclearance, so it was one of the states from which it was removed. But to your point, if a state wasn't considered to have had a history of discriminatory practices in its voting procedures, then it wasn't required to be precleared. And to come back to the argument about discrimination, I suppose you could argue that many states perhaps that might have been shown to have a history of discrimination were not covered. And so there was a certain bias in that.
We made a bunch of notes about kind of how to proceed, but a lot of them are more so talking about voting itself. And so I guess I want to hear from both of you. Just what do you guys think that, or why is voting important? Just for what reason? If someone asked you, why should I go vote? What would you tell them?
I was listening to one of your sources that you put at the bottom of your index. I guess it was I can't remember. Was it Aunt Annie Beatrice? Is that her name? Well, she said that some people, and it struck me as being really pertinent. She said some people say, "Well, I'm just not into politics," and her reply was something like, "Well, are you into water? Are you into healthcare? Are you into sovereignty? There's so many things that are determined by the vote." Just this last year, in 2020, in Oklahoma, the people basically defied the state legislature and the governor and said, "Yeah, we want to expand Medicaid." And that would have been one of my examples because of the importance of the Native American vote. Because I've read an article from the Oklahoma Policy Institute, which said that it was so close, and that in every county that had the larger the percentage of Native Americans in a county, the higher the vote in favor of expanding Medicaid, and that the Native vote probably made the difference. And the tribes that endorsed it, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Potawatomi, Muskogee Creek, they all endorsed it. And according to the Oklahoma Policy Institute, that made the difference. So, I mean, that's healthcare for literally thousands of Oklahomans. And we, the people, we got that, despite the fact that the state legislature said, no, we don't want to expand Medicaid in the state. And the governor said no.
To jump on Dr. Savage's point, I mean, I think that a lot of Americans, not just Native Americans, perhaps discount the impact that their vote might have, perhaps because they're looking at federal elections where the vote margin in their district, their state may be so large they don't feel they're going to have a major impact. But state and local elections, which do, as Dr. Savage pointed out, control your water, control your day-to-day lives, to a far greater extent in many cases than the federal government does. Those are still very much in play. And states like Oklahoma that have initiatives and referenda give the voters the direct say in laws. And many ballot initiatives don't fit easily along partisan lines. And so their outcomes, especially in states like Oklahoma, can be quite unpredictable. Just to add another point, I think it's tempting to only think of voting and the decision to vote as an individual act, but I think it's also worth noting that as a group, right, whether you're talking about an interest group or a racial or ethnic group, a lot of your leverage in American politics comes from your share of the vote. And it's difficult to negotiate outside of elections, right? Regardless of whether or not you think elections themselves make a huge difference, the lobbying and persuasion efforts outside of elections in some ways fall back on the leverage that a vote can gain you. And so as a group, any group that's seeking to have more say in the laws that govern their daily lives, I think should look at increasing their overall turnout rate as a way to increase the group say, not just an individual's say.
Yeah, something that voting is definitely, I've seen it just talked about a lot just today, like on social media. It's like, oh, you don't like what's happening? Just get out and vote. Like voting is seen as like a fix-all for everything. And it's like just that one day will determine everything else. And it does to a certain extent, but I think talking about civic engagement when talking about voting, you can't have one without the other. It's the people on the ground, it's the organizers, and something that I was just talking about is, coming from a position of trying to get so many people to vote and seeing that, whether it's a national election, a local election, tribal election. People they feel like their vote doesn't count, but that's all that they're doing is voting. They're not talking to their representatives. They're not, having those conversations or protesting a civic engagement, talking about the things that are important to them. And I think that, when we talk about voting, it needs to have more of that, just civic engagement as a whole. Like voting, you are talking about what you want to see, but if you're only doing that one time every 4 years, then you're not really giving your opinion. You're not really doing those things in the way that we would like to see them done. And so that's something that is very near and dear to my heart when talking about these issues. And yeah, I guess we can go into how to vote. I just got my absentee ballot, and that was super exciting. It's really kind of intimidating when you get a ballot or when you look at it, and a lot of like local media doesn't really talk about the things that are going to be on the ballot as much. With expanding Medicaid, I feel like that was very like public. That was things that are going to be elected more so in the primaries are things we want to get this on the ballot or we want to do this. They're a lot more talked about. But I got my ballot and I saw that there were, I think it was 6 judges up for re-election. And I know that we've talked about that in classes with both of you. It's people don't really look at their judges. And if they do, they're like, hasn't affected me. But I did a lot of research and I actually made a Facebook post just talking about, this is the history of these judges. This is kind of what they've done just with information that I could easily find.
Well, I never looked at the judges until I started getting the mail-in ballot, because then I had time. And for the first time, I started looking at them and saying, who are these people? And I still didn't find out a whole bunch, but I'm a political partisan, and I looked to see who appointed them. And if I didn't like who appointed them, then I voted against them. And if I liked who appointed them, then I voted for them to be reinstated. Because basically that's all you get to vote on in regard to judges is, do they keep their seat or not? But yeah, I think that the take home or the mail-in ballot makes a big difference, just precisely because it gives you that time to actually look at the issues, look at the candidates. In the past, I would just show up at the polling station and I would see the judges. I'd never heard of them before, so I would just say yes, 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 reappoint all of them. So my vote was pretty much meaningless until I got to spend time, looking at who they were.
I mean, there's good evidence that retention elections have exactly that effect of mostly keeping the incumbent in office for precisely the mechanism that Dr. Savage described. Elected judges in general, there's a lot of controversial literature in political science about exactly what's achieved by having nonpartisan elected judges. Arguably removing partisanship, while the hope is that it's going to inspire research on the part of the voter, instead takes away the key piece of information that they have to vote. And I mean, most states, including Oklahoma, allow you to look up your ballot in advance. If you're going to vote in person, you can go and get your sample ballot. But other states also send out ballot guides, right? So that actually provide more detailed information. And of course, both national and state organizations provide their own ballot guides to you. But to your point, Liz, the average voter who may view voting as already a bigger task than they necessarily want to engage in, but will do so out of some sense of civic duty, doesn't necessarily feel inclined to go out and do that kind of research. And I think states which run our electoral systems often have a tension between those who want to help voters and educate voters and those who view that, right, essentially adopt the view that if you don't know or don't care to know, that's your problem, right? And I think that many states instead take an alternative approach that educating voters is instead the responsibility of the electoral system, that making the information as widely known and available as possible is the responsibility of the states that run the electoral system, as opposed to shifting the onus onto voters. But as we may get into today, the American electoral system in general shifts a lot of responsibility onto voters that many other countries don't.
I remember the first time that I voted, I turned 18 in 2016. Like, I think I voted like early in person. I was the first person in Woodbury County to vote. I got on the news. That was when I interned for the Iowa Democratic Party, and they didn't tell me, like, they just told me look nice that day, and I was like, okay. And so I showed up to breakfast, and then the news people were there, and they're like, they're gonna interview you. And I was like, oh, I was not prepared for this. But I remember I was so excited just to be able to vote, and I was so excited, like, finally, like, I'm able to voice my opinion. I'm able to do these things. And then when I looked at the ballot, I was like, I have no idea what some of these things are. Or like when it talks about like local elections and those, I didn't know that it was all on the same ballot, or like I had to fill all those things out. And I remember for school board, I was in college at that point, in a town that I didn't grow up in. I didn't know anything, but I just saw a cool last name and I was like, oh, school board, like, I hope he gets it. And that was it. And so I think it really just comes down to, this ballot structure. I know that's like who's the first name on the ballot, those kind of things. And the wording too. The wording for the ballot initiatives, or I can't remember if that's what that's called, is really confusing. And I'm 99% sure, that's intentional, of trying to say, how do you support this? Or like, do you support this initiative? But using like double negatives and those kind of things just to confuse voters into like, do I support this? Do I support the way that they're saying this, or do I not? Or those kind of things. And so voting can be confusing, and finding like where you're trying to your polling place and all of those things.
A few years ago, when I was still living in California, environmental groups put an initiative on the ballot, and the lumber industry was opposed to it. So what they did was they put another initiative on the ballot, and they sold it as pro-environmental. But what it was going to do was the regulations were not going to be nearly as harsh on the lumber industry as the genuine environmentalist initiative was. And so the whole point was to try to confuse voters and to try to get voters to vote for their pro-environmental initiative, which is really an initiative by the lumber industry. So I think that trying to confuse voters and trying to manipulate those initiatives is, that's all part of the game.
Kind of moving forward, YouTube might be a little bit more familiar with Oklahoma voting laws than I am. If you are a student, then do you have to vote from wherever your home is, or can you register if you live on campus? Are you allowed to do so and vote in Tahlequah?
You're allowed to use your campus address as your registered address, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
I believe that's true, because we've had registration drives the last several years, and we get that question all the time from the students. Do I have to go home? Do I have to vote there? Can I vote here?
You have to register as with the campus address. That's worth noting. But
right.
You can't. Because as Dr. Savage should point out, occasionally we will have students who don't realize that they can't vote at a local precinct on the day of the election, despite being registered somewhere else. But you can register on campus and vote in the local precinct.
So something that I remember in Iowa, that was a big thing that we had dealt with, but it was having our IDs. They didn't line up with the address then that we have. And so does Oklahoma, I guess when you do go to vote, what do you have to bring with you, or how do you prove like, hey, this is me, I'm coming to vote?
Either a voter registration card that's issued to you by the state, or a photo ID issued by the state. The address on your photo ID does not have to match your registration, so long as it's your legal state issued ID and it matches your the name matches the name that you're registered under. But the address on your ID doesn't have to match your current state registration. So to your point, a student could move to Tahlequah, register to vote, for instance, in the upcoming election, vote in a local precinct in Tahlequah without having to necessarily get a new driver's license. And for that matter, might then, list their parents' address for their tax returns or things like that.
So what about for out-of-state students? Are they allowed to vote in Tahlequah, or do they have to have established residency and then they can vote, or do they have to vote in whatever state that they're from?
You would have to establish residency. You have to be a legal resident of the state. So, for example, a state-issued ID would have to be an Oklahoma state-issued ID.
That broke my heart. I wasn't able to vote in 2018 as I was trying to establish residency here. I wasn't allowed to vote in Iowa because I was trying to prove that I'm a citizen of Oklahoma, and in doing so, that was Steve King's race in that year, and so that just absolutely shattered my heart that I could not participate in. So I actually just kind of talking about the Snyder Act and the Dawes Act. So the Dawes Act, Native Americans could technically have the right to vote, and they could technically be citizens if they just, I don't know if it's unaffiliated themselves then with their tribes, And then if they took on like the Western way of living, then they would be able to become citizens and vote. And then in 1924, that was when Native Americans then were guaranteed the right to citizenship, just without all of that. There was another act, I can't remember the name of it. I believe it was in the late 1890s, but Native Americans were able to go through the same process as immigrants coming to the United States to become citizens. And so if they then, kind of similar to that act, but they had to apply then to become citizens in the country that they were born in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was talking to my aunt a little bit earlier, and my family, they're a little bit older. My aunt was born in 1933, and my grandmother then, both my grandparents were born in 1914. And so they were 10 years old then when they became citizens of the country that they were born in, which absolutely blows my mind when I think about it. And when I was talking to my aunt, she said, that's just the way that they grew up, not necessarily knowing what rights they had and what they didn't. They didn't have that education. And so they just kind of were, especially then, it kind of felt like they were in a limbo stage of where can they vote? In California, that's where I believe my grandmother was born. She was able to vote then in 1915, but she wasn't a citizen until 9 years after that. And so that just absolutely blows my mind every time I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, after, the barriers that we're talking about are primarily barriers to automatic citizenship by birth on American soil. Naturalization routes at various points had been open, for instance, naturalization through military service and things like that. Although I believe after World War I or World War II, there was another instance of Native Americans who had served in the military, and Congress has often had special naturalization procedures for those who've served in the U.S. military, struggled actually to have those guaranteed by their states. And really until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, states still had broad discretion to deny the vote to people who had attained citizenship through these naturalization procedures. But the states manage our voting systems. And so they would still regularly deny them.
Yeah, that was World War One.
World War
I. After our previous conversation, I realized I didn't get to really talk about, I don't think I did, my perspective of why I think voting is important. And so I wrote down, I have a little soapbox that I'm going to get on for that. And so just, talking about my family, my grandmother then, when I was talking to my aunt, she was telling me stories about My grandmother was a Democrat through and through. They used to go campaigning. They didn't formally campaign for anything, but they had signs that they would then post everywhere where they could, whether it be like a stop sign or some random fence post or like an abandoned yard or something. They would put those signs up and talk about their right to vote and wanting to campaign for anyone going up for election. And so when I think about this, I think about the struggles that my ancestors then went through at that time. And it wasn't even that long ago. Really thinking about it, that wasn't that long ago that they went through these struggles and they had these things happen, and they were going through all of this. And so I've had a lot of people talk about, even now, especially in this election, a lot of Native people saying that they don't want to vote. And I understand where they're coming from, because Native Americans were not meant to vote. This was a system that was not meant for Native Americans. It is a system that was meant to suppress people of color, minorities, and just have those people in charge, continue to stay in charge. And so an argument that I hear a lot is, voting is sacred, but voting isn't sacred. Voting was not meant for us. It's not sacred, if it's not meant for us. But that doesn't mean that it's not important. Our ancestors, some of them had no interest in voting. They had no interest in becoming citizens because they knew that that meant that they had to give up some of their ways. And thinking about, where we are today versus where we were then, we made a lot of progress, and it's been those ancestors, it's been those people who fought for our rights that we have today and guaranteed that we have those. The system was not created for us, but we're still able to make our voices heard. Those who came before us, those who were the activists, those who pushed through all of these issues, guaranteed, our rights to the land. Native Americans not having the rights to their land, the tribes not having those rights. People had to fight for those. And sovereignty, the fact that, tribes weren't able to elect their own chiefs until like the 1970s. And life, just straight up, we had to fight for the right to live in the country that we were born, the country that was made for us, our land, our people. We had to fight for the right to live. And so they gave us those rights. They gave us those rights by advocating for the next generations. They weren't doing it just for them. They were doing it for those who came after. And now here we are today. And it is our duty to continue that fight, continue to make sure that we not only keep the rights that we have, but continue to have those for the next generations to come. And so civic engagement in all its forms, that is something that I'm very passionate about. Civic engagement through voting, is not enough. You have to be an engaged voter. You have to be, if you want something to change, you have to talk to the people who make the changes. Talk to your representatives. If you're not happy about something, protesting, totally okay form of civic engagement. Just being involved, other than just at the ballot box, is so incredibly important. And that is how we can guarantee those rights. That is how we are able to make our voices heard and to ensure that the next generations have it better than we have it today. And so that was just my soapbox that I was thinking.
Very well said.
Yeah, it is very well said. And I think that pointing out that your ancestors fought for this right, and so you have an obligation to vote. But I think another perspective is that the people that have oppressed you in the past and in today don't want natives to vote. So to quote Auntie Beatrice again, if you want to stick it to the man, vote.
So the deadline to request an absentee ballot in Oklahoma for this upcoming election is October 27th at 5 p.m. So if you're voting in the general election by absentee ballot or physically, election day is November 3rd of this year. You can vote early at the County Election Board office in the county where you're registered to vote from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. on Thursday and Friday before all elections. For state and federal elections only, early voting is available from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. on the Saturday before the election.
The 9th is the registration deadline, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And so just if you are registering to vote at this point, the best bet that you have to ensure that you are registered in time is to take the form to the election commission yourself, just so you know that it's there. So I know that there have been some voting drives that sometimes the forms can get lost or misplaced and just in between that. So just to ensure that you are registered to vote, the best way to do that is to just get it there yourself.
In 2015, Oklahoma passed a bill that would allow for online registration, but it's going to take a while before it actually becomes a reality. Right now, about the most that you can do is change your address online.
Thank you for tuning in to Native Narrative, and a special thanks to the Native American Support Center for allowing us to speak today about Native Americans and voting. Tune in to the next episode.
Thank you all so much.
Wanishi.
Mado.
Yakoki.
Mado. Yakoki.
Mado.
Weeblong. Arhihet. Mado.
Pound Danyan Yahi Yaye.